Good afternoon, everyone. Russell Holden with Render Plus Software. I want to welcome you to today's live webinar, Adding Reflections to Materials in SketchUp Models. And I want to invite each of you, if you have questions during the webinar, please ask them. I have the monitor in front of me, and I will pause and address your question, giving you as much information as I can. This is about developing your skills with iRender Next so that you'll have a lot of fun creating great presentation images. Now, before we start talking about the iRender Next interface, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at a few renderings from our gallery and discuss some of the reflections in the renderings that help enhance the realism of the model. This is actually one of my favorite renderings. This is of a Roman bath. This is a model that was grabbed from the 3D warehouse. And the only thing that we did to alter this model was we added ripples to the top of the water. It makes the water much more reflective, and you can see there are a lot of nice things happening with the light on top of this water. Not so obvious, this rendering, but I wanted to show you that the quality of the reflection is very important with regard to realism. The only reflection of note in this model, and I think that the creator of this rendering could have gone a little bit further, but didn't. The focal point of the model with regard to reflections is really the tabletop. You'll notice the highlighting from the artificial light sources on the top of that table. That's a very subtle reflection added to that tabletop that produces that nice finish on the table. This is a brand new rendering that was added to our gallery. I just grabbed it this morning. This is by Edgar Lopez. It's a cafe model that he made with SketchUp and then rendered with iRender Next. And you'll notice that he has a nice water feature with reflections going on. He's also, in terms of his plaza, he's added reflections to that, looks like a brick pattern. The glass is also reflecting, as you would expect. Reflections are very important, and they don't always have to be mirror-like. Sometimes they can be pretty subtle, as in the case of this brick. But it adds considerably to the quality of the model. Probably one of the more realistic renderings that I've seen in quite a while is this bathroom modeled with SketchUp, rendered with iRender Next. And again, there are reflections in varying degrees, but virtually every material in this model actually has reflective attributes set. The mirror is obvious, it's behaving like a mirror. All of the hardware for the faucets they look like they're nickel plated, very shiny, very reflective. Also this nice towel bar. But the most impressive reflections in this model from my point of view are the tile on the walls. The highlighting in this part of the rendering is caused by reflections added to the material. Where there's sunlight and so a little bit more light, and also you can start to see the reflection of the window over on the left side of this rendering. All of this because the model builder using iRender Next has great control over adding reflections to materials. So let's talk specifically about how that's done. I've created a very simple little model. And prior to adding reflections to any of the materials, the model renders like this. Now the lighting is not so bad, so you might decide that, you know what, this is not really a bad rendering at all. But let's talk about what's really happening with these materials and try to make everything a little bit more realistic, so that in the end, when I've added reflections, I get a much more impressive result. Again, the rendering before, reflections are added. So let's get started. Now, iRenderNext has the ability to add reflective properties, and it can be a little bit tricky if you have never used a rendering program before. Once your model is loaded, all that you need to do is right-click on a material, and you will get an iRenderNext Edit Material option off of a pop-up dialog. When you click Edit Material, this dialog displays. This is the iRenderNext Edit Material dialog. And what I've done is I've clicked all the way over to the right. On the version that you have installed, the tab labeled Default in my little image here is probably labeled Presets. That's a recent change that we made to the software because Presets is much more descriptive of the options on this menu. Now that lamp is currently rendered with a matte finish. Now I suggested earlier, before we got started, that all materials are reflective, and in fact they are. A matte finish means that the surface of this lamp is rough, and so the reflection is diffused. That's why it's not more mirror-like. If we decide that we want to make this lamp a little bit more reflective, we might select plastic as the reflective preset. When plastic is selected, the intensity of the reflection is very low. Intensity just means how bright is the reflection in the material. I have a question. The question is, what if I want a plastic with some transparency? Should I click plastic first and then transparency? That is actually a very good question. And the answer is that the order wouldn't really make any difference. If you set the transparent value that you want first and then set reflection, that's fine. You can also set reflection first. Make sure that the reflection is exactly what you want on the opaque surface, and then make it more transparent. But the reality is, I would say whichever attribute you're less certain of, how transparent to make it, or perhaps the reflective attributes, set the one that you're least sure of first and then proceed to the second. When we select a preset, for example plastic, there are two values that are being set. The first is intensity and the second is sharpness. Sharpness refers to the smoothness of the surface. Glass, for example, is perfectly smooth. And so when you increase this value, you can use the slider bar or you can type in a value. When you increase sharpness, you're making the surface more smooth and so more glass-like. The lower the value, you're making the surface rougher, and so you'll get more of a diffused reflection. as in the case of plastic. The value is actually set very low, 0.2, and so we're getting a diffused reflection. Notice that when we select the preset metal, we get the lamp all of a sudden looks like brass. That's because when we select metal, the intensity of the reflection is set to 0.9. Now 1 would be absolutely mirror-like. So what we're seeing here is still the nice brass look, but the intensity of the reflection set very high. You'll notice that you can actually see the reflections of the brick, although distorted because of the round lamp, and the sharpness is set as high as it'll go, a value of 1. So we're suggesting that this is a very polished material. You'll also notice that metallic is checked. Now this is an interesting option for rendering. When metallic is checked, it means that the reflections will appear in the color of the material. In this case, the material, as you can see, is kind of a gold color, and so all of the reflections are displaying in shades of that color. That's what metallic does. When we check glossy, this is interesting because glossy means that only the reflections of light will render. So what you're seeing are highlights from the artificial light sources that are in this space. Because metallic is checked, those reflections of light sources are in the color of the material. If we uncheck metallic, now those reflections are in the color of the light. And you know, when I made this rendering, I probably should have put in a green light and a red light so that you would see that. All the lights, as it turns out, are pretty white. However, if any of those lights were green, for example, you would actually see green reflections in this rendering. So again, when metallic is checked, the reflections are in the color of the material. When metallic is unchecked, the reflections are in the color of the lights. Now here we are back to the preset metal, which again, a very high intensity, so a clear reflection, and a very high sharpness, meaning that the material is very smooth. Now you'll notice that the reflection is actually quite impressive, and it does in fact look like a very polished brass lamp. Even when you select presets, you actually have the ability to adjust values. So for example, I lowered the sharpness, and the reason that I did that is because I'm going to be viewing this lamp in my rendering from across the room, and I wanted to make sure that the nice reflections showed up really, really well. So here are the two side by side. On the left, a very smooth surface, and then on the right, a roughened up surface, which is diffusing the reflection. I thought it would be interesting to point out one additional thing. You'll notice that I'm using a photo material, brick, in my rendering, and it of course is perfect because it is a photograph of brick, but I thought what I might want to do is make the brick, give the brick a little bit more relief. And so with photo materials, on the texture editor, you'll see an addition of auto bump. And what auto bump is going to do is it's going to, when this material renders, it's going to give it some relief to make it look more three-dimensional. That'll be more apparent when I shift the view in just a few minutes. I think this is a Frank Lloyd Wright design chair made of wood, and this is what it looks like when it renders straight from the 3D warehouse. We can improve it. So I right click on the wood, and again, what we're going to do is we're going to set values for the reflection, intensity, and sharpness. Now I'm making it a very intense reflection because I want to see the reflection from across the room, and then I'm lowering the sharpness because wood is not going to reflect like a mirror. So I'm making the surface rough like wood by lowering the sharpness value. So I get very, very nice reflections of the light on this wood. You know, sometimes when you're using SketchUp, it's not quite so obvious the things to do to improve on the rendered image of objects that you might grab from the warehouse. These pictures are a good example. I liked these pictures, but I want them to render as though there's glass in front of them. And so in order to do that, I actually added a surface in front of the pictures, and I specified that it was glass using the Edit Material preset. And so now I get glass in front of these pictures. That took a couple of minutes and improved my rendering considerably. Here's how glass works. When we right-click on the top of this table, what we're going to do is we're going to specify that the material for the glass in this table is thick glass. The benefit of thick glass is that thick glass will also let you increase the amount of refracted light through the table, and will also let you set a caustic value. Caustic means that when light travels through the table, bounces off of the floor, and then back up through the table, some of that light is lost. So it'll make it look a little bit like tinted glass. When you select glass, either thick or thin, there are reflection values that are preset. And again, you can adjust these if you want, but if you really want the glass to look like glass, the default values are set to do just that for you. So before making the table glass, and then after, much more convincing. Next is the floor. Now the floor is an interesting example of the ability to manage the quality of the reflection. So for example, we could make the floor look highly polished like a bowling alley, or we can make it look a little bit less reflective, probably more like the finish of a floor in a small office. When the sharpness value for a reflection is turned down, what we get is kind of a fuzzy reflection, not quite so mirror-like. And in this case, it gives me the impression of more of a satin type of finish on my floor. And we're going to improve on that in just a few minutes. Now the little vase on the table, that's another really interesting example, and I'm going to pause because we have another question. What can I do with the other options like pyramid on a surface? Now pyramid is a texture, and the pyramid texture can be added to any material. That is a bump texture, and what it's going to do is add a pyramid shaped bump at whatever scale you decide onto any material that you add it to. And the same is true of the other textures, by the way. So one of them is marbled, one of them is wrinkled, one of them is rubble. When you add those, it's giving what would otherwise be a surface that is rendered as flat, a bump texture, and then because of that, the light will interact with those textures in a very interesting way. And I guess the example that I've showed you so far would be the water in that Roman bath, which had a marbled texture, or excuse me, a wrinkled texture added, and then by setting the scale of that wrinkled texture, we're able to manage how rough the surface of that water is. Does that help you? Okay. We may have internet slower than I think, so I'll let Camilo. There we go. Okay, great. Keep asking questions because that helps everybody. Okay, so I had this really interesting little vase on the table, and it's a glass vase, and it's also, I wanted this vase to have kind of an opalescent look. And so instead of going to a preset, what I've done is I've set the intensity on my own, and I set the sharpness on my own, and then I went ahead and clicked metallic, because we know that metallic means that all of the reflections are going to be in the color of the material, which is really nice. And the result, once I do that, I've also set, by the way, transparency to 10%. So this is not a perfectly transparent piece of glass. And I think you'll be very surprised by the result that I get. So I get a very nice looking glass vase. The point is that the presets are a great start. And in most cases, when you select a preset, the reflection attributes are going to be exactly what you want. Then when you get comfortable with what these values mean, you'll find that you can do some very creative things by setting values on your own. So I want to encourage everyone, experiment with those. You'll be very, very happy with the results that you'll get. And you know, just for fun, I decided I wanted to make the column reflective, and here's why. Generally, what I see in renderings, even for surfaces that are intended to be painted, those surfaces tend to look way too flat because paint also reflects. And so I'm going to exaggerate the reflection on this column just a little bit, and you'll see the result in just a minute. So on the left is the column prior to adding the reflections, and now I mentioned that it was pretty exaggerated because it gives me sort of the look of wrapping that column in vinyl. I think you would all agree that it's probably a little exaggerated. You know, there's another thing I wanted to point out, and this is how important it is to pay attention to detail in your models, especially when you grab things from the warehouse. There's no way I'm going to spend the time to build a model of an Eames chair when a perfectly wonderful Eames chair is available off of the 3D warehouse. However, because the chair was made with SketchUp and probably originally rendered with SketchUp, you'll notice on the left that what really is leather actually looks very, very flat. Now, I'm always interested in trying to improve the realism of the model, and so I added some very subtle reflection to the leather, and I hope you'll agree that while the chair on the right, a beautiful model, is not quite as convincing with regard to the leather as the chair on the left, not as convincing as the chair on the right. I think the chair on the right looks like it's upholstered with leather. Here's the model prior to adding any reflections, and here's the model after the reflections have been added. I want you for just a minute to pay particular attention to the floor, because remember I mentioned that I wanted the floor to have kind of a softer finish, more of a satin finish on this floor. And this is going to illustrate a very important feature of rendering. This is what the floor looks like after 5 passes. You can see that the floor is very reflective, but I don't quite have the fuzzy, soft reflection that I'm after. So I'm going to let this render more passes. Here we are after 10 passes. It's improving, but still not quite there. Here we are after 20 passes. It's getting considerably better. If I were crunched for time and needed to get to a meeting to show this to a client, I would probably take this rendering. However, if I can wait for 50 passes, my rendering is even better. And now at 100 passes, this is very nice to take to a client. I got a little bit carried away because this rendering was actually very finished at around 300 passes, but you know, I decided let's let it run for 1,000 and see what happens. I think if I showed you the 500 pass rendering versus this one, there's actually very little difference. However, with iRenderNext, you can actually let your renderings process indefinitely, and the renderings will continue to improve the solution. I think all of us would agree that with deadlines there is a limit, and the most important thing is to make the meeting. So there are times when you want to stop the rendering, grab the image, and go to your meeting. However, I did accomplish exactly what I wanted in that I have a very nice finish on the floor, which, because it occupies so much of the area of this rendering, was a pretty important feature to get rendered properly. So I have really nice reflections on the table. I put glass over the pictures. I've got nice reflections on my brass lamp. My vase on the table is very convincing. The reflections on the chair are subtle but important. And of course, little details. For example, doing what I can to make this Eames chair look more realistic by modifying the upholstery so that it looks like leather. I'm going to pause and ask, are there any questions about any of the information that we have covered so far? Now let's take a look at those images that I showed you when we first got started. So again, you know, it doesn't appear that there's a whole lot going on in this model where reflections play an important role. But I think you would agree that the water and the reflective properties established for the water contribute in a very important way to the realism of this image. Similarly, the reflections on the table, you'll notice also that the sink, the porcelain sink, also has some nice reflections set, making it look more realistic. I think Edgar did just a fine job with this model, and I'm getting to know Edgar because he actually is kind enough to share renderings with us pretty frequently by uploading them to our gallery. And I hope that all of you as well, when you finish a rendering that you're particularly happy with, especially when you believe that it demonstrates some important skills with rendering programs, please share them on our gallery. And then, you know, still one of my all-time favorites, because the reflections are admittedly in most parts of this rendering very subtle, but without them, this rendering would be very flat and not nearly as realistic looking. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to digress. And I'm going to digress by showing you a rendering that is actually currently in process. And I mentioned before that this is a rendering that we captured from the 3D warehouse. And it's actually currently in process. So at this point in time, we've made 81 passes. This is a pretty high resolution rendering that I'm working on. And I'm actually using an unbiased rendering engine, which is available in iRenderNext. We have both engines available. We have a biased engine and an unbiased engine. This is using the unbiased engine. I'm kind of experimenting with it a little bit. And I wrote an article recently about how you are able with iRender Next to do things like adjust the quality of the rendering even while it's in process. And I want to give you an example of that. So this is actually a rendering in process. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this little button right up here, which is the Tone and Filters dialog. Brings up this menu. So even while my rendering is in process, I can do things like dim the image. So I'm making it darker. I can also manipulate things like the saturation of the color. Now, when the image is darker, it makes sense that the colors would become a little bit more intense. But just for fun, let's lower the saturation of color. Now, what's interesting about this is that I'm making changes while this rendering is in process. And the rendering will continue to process using these new rules that I've set for the rendering. Equally interesting is the ability, I'm going to close this dialog, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this light bulb. This is the light balance dialog. Again, you're able to make changes to the rendering even while it's in process. You don't have to wait for it to finish. So if you see a rendering that's processing and you decide, oh, you know, the materials are really nice, everything looks great, but that lighting is not quite bright enough. Well, the problem that I think I have with the lighting in this rendering right now, since I darkened the image a little bit, is that the sun is just not bright enough. So let's kick it up a notch. Now this will take just a second because, again, this is a rendering that is in process. And we'll kick it up a little bit more. So I'm going to continue to brighten the sun. And one of the areas where you will notice the change is on that back wall where the reflection of the sun off of the water becomes considerably more apparent. Now remember that I started by darkening the image a little bit, and then what I'm doing is I'm brightening up the sun, and it's really helping with the depth in this rendering that I'm processing. And you'll notice that interesting things start to happen over here on this chair. That chair pad is white, the wood is kind of a blonde wood, and so now, you know, there's direct sun hitting it and it's getting very, very bright, which actually looks very realistic. I wanted to point this out because I don't think that it's maybe particularly well known that adjusting using tone and filter, the tone and filter dialog, and also using our light balance dialog is possible to allow you to improve the quality of the rendering while it is processing. And we have a question. What kind of texture do you use on the water? The water texture is actually using wrinkled. It's set to a scale of 10, and it's set to an intensity of 4. Looks pretty realistic, doesn't it? By increasing the scale, you'll make the surface of the water look more rough. Now in this rendering, since it is still water, we wanted to keep the water relatively calm. But certainly for an outdoor pool where maybe you've got swimmers active in the water, you'd want to make the water look considerably more rough than this. Are there any more questions? Again, I want to remind you that I have recorded this webinar, and so probably sometime tomorrow, a video of this webinar will be available on the Render Plus Systems YouTube channel. That'll allow you to share today's webinar information with your colleagues There are other webinars that we've recorded that are on our YouTube channel, as well as lots of very interesting tutorials. I'm also hoping that everyone got our email that we sent out today, a rendering tip talking about biased and unbiased renderings, biased and unbiased rendering engines. There's a lot of talk on the internet and on blogs about which one is better. I sent out the email to you today to let you know that when you are using iRenderNext, you actually have both. And both can be extremely valuable depending on the type of model that you've created, the type of rendering that you want to produce, and when your deadline is looming. So, provide you with some tips on why you may, for one rendering or another, select either the biased or unbiased engine. Well, I hope that this has been helpful information. I appreciate you being here this afternoon. Look for the video of today's webinar on the Render Plus Systems YouTube channel. We'll be scheduling more webinars coming up in the near future. Check our schedule on our website, renderplus.com. Thanks very much for the questions. Thanks for attending, and I hope you'll join us again real soon for another live webinar on iRenderNext.